3 años y medio es el tiempo que llevo aprendiendo el español por mi cuenta. Y yo
This is
diría que
Ben, a
aprendí
Spanish learner whose accent is about as good as it
básicamente
gets. Living
todo
in
con el
Europe, he is
español.
regularly mistaken for being a
Eh,
native by Spanish speakers. Even
pero
upon learning
sí
he's
que
not a
tengo que
native, they can
decirte
never guess
que
where he's from,
antes había
always
estudiado
being surprised to
clases de
find out he's from
español
England.
en español en
In the
la
description
escuela.
is a link to this short video of him speaking, so you can judge for yourself.
Cuando, no sé,
I would have
llevo
thought he's a native speaker
desde el
too,
año que
and I'm so
estuve
jealous of his
fuera.
accent.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ben, and I'm 21 years old, and I'm from England. So with my Spanish, I started learning it by myself 3.5 years ago, after a bit of time in school before that, but mostly by myself. And for me, like I've really come to enjoy learning language as I've gone along, and that's why I've been doing it so long and I've dedicated so much time to it. But yeah, I would say my level of Spanish is a good solid C1 level at the moment. That is self-evaluated, so uh, you never know. But I've had lots of people that have told me that my Spanish is good and that I definitely have no problem with a lot of situations speaking the language and all that.
Yeah, your accent is really good for 3.5 years in. I really would have thought you were a native speaker.
Thank you. Well, actually, the accent is the part that I have focused the most on. Of course, it's important to study or to look at all the areas of language learning, but
Right.
perhaps the pronunciation and the accent is the part I'm most interested in, or I've come to be most interested in during my learning, because before I wasn't interested at all in that side of things, and I've just realized that that was something I really liked as I've gone along. So I definitely put a lot of effort into it.
Yeah, it's really good to put effort into something that um, like when you first start speaking a language, what people judge you by isn't like your the slang or vocabulary or grammar, but it's always the accent. So it's good to make sure that that's your focus. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I've definitely
go ahead.
realized that when you first start speaking, then they immediately can tell that you've put a lot of effort into it. And even now, like when I speak to people, well, they definitely they can never tell where I'm from exactly. Depends on what we're talking about, but usually at the start they might even think I'm Spanish for a bit. Obviously,
Yeah.
I can't they can't get them to think I'm Spanish for the whole time, but definitely I've had conversations with people, and then at the end they've said, "Oh wow," or when I've mentioned that I wasn't Spanish, they've been surprised or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So uh, what was your first, I guess, contact with Spanish, or what got you into the language?
Uh, well, actually, it was a long time ago. Well, not a long time ago because I'm still young, but when I was in primary school, so when I had like 7 or 8, when I was 7 or 8 years old, they we didn't really learn Spanish because we were so young and didn't really teach anything. We learned a bit of French, but that was something else. And but there was one of the teachers that we had, and in primary school you have the same teacher for everything here, and she was Spanish. So what I remember one day or maybe a couple of days, she taught us how to say the numbers 1 to 10 in Spanish, and maybe just how to say hello and all like the greetings. But yeah, so that was the first contact I had with it. But of course, I was so young, so I don't even know why I remember that. But um,
Right.
more recently, then I studied it in school for the 2 years when between I was 14 and 16 years old. Um, so that was really like my first proper contact with it.
Okay, and those must have been like high school courses taught by your teacher.
Yeah, yeah. So in England, we have a GCSE, which is the General Certificate of Secondary Education, which you basically do when you're 16 years old. You do some exams. So it was proper for the end of, well, I'm not sure how it works in the US, but it's when you're 16 years old, you have these exams, and that's like the end of secondary school for us, before you go on to do the proper exams, which will let you enter the university. So these are decent exams. It's like you're already 14, 15 years old, so like you're actually studying it in school rather than just learning a bit.
So you bas-
But yeah,
so you could
sure.
basically graduate at 16, or
Uh, well, if you still have to study until you're 18 years old, but if you don't want to go to university, you can go and do something else, which is more like an apprenticeship or something like that when you're 16. But you can't just work when from 16 years old. You still have to continue studies until you're 18.
okay. So you studied, had brief contact with language when you were 7 or 8, and then you studied it more from 14 to 16. And
Yes.
in secondary school, when you were studying it, were you interested in the language, or were you just taking classes because you had to take it to advance?
Uh, well, no, actually, it was something I chose to do myself because we have four subjects there's like 9 or 10 that we do in total, and four of them we can choose when we're 14 years old. And before that, we studied a bit of French and German in school, but then we got the choice. And for the people that were the best at languages or had got the best grades before you're 14 years old, were allowed to choose Spanish. This was in my school. It's not like a general thing, but you were allowed to choose Spanish because it was the new language that we'd never studied before, and you were going to do the within 2 years to do the exams. Whereas with French and German, we'd already done like a couple of years before that, so in theory it would be easier. But Spanish was like for the people that were already getting the best grades in the languages that could go on and study Spanish from scratch in those 2 years.
Yeah. So I guess when you originally started taking these classes, were you just taking the classes alone, or were you studying by your own time as well as taking the classes?
No, I only did like the bare minimum outside, like the homework that was set and that. But it was really just following it in school and doing that. Like at that point, I wasn't motivated to study anything by myself, so I just did the schoolwork and the homework, and that was it.
Yeah. So at what point did you kind of get motivated to get good at this language? Did it happen during your time studying from ages 14 to 16, or was it after that?
Definitely not during that time. During that time, I just did it as something in school. I was mildly interested in languages. I don't even remember why, but it was just something I did in school. It was just a subject. And actually, after that, I didn't do any languages at all for 2 years. So
Oh, wow.
like I didn't study it in school even or at home. It's nothing. But then when I left school was when I decided that I'd actually like to speak a language, a different language, because in England most people just speak one unless they have parents from a different background. So for me, it was definitely I wanted to be able to speak with someone in different language because it just seems so strange and a bit exotic. I wanted to see what it was like. Um, but yeah, so when I left school, that was when I started, and I gradually got more motivated. Like I was just mildly interested at the start, but yeah, I think when you get to university, uh, you're much more independent with your learning, and I definitely was surrounded by good people that were motivated and they learned things by themselves, and that helped me like um, get interested to get motivated to study myself something, which in my case was Spanish.
Yeah, that sounds exactly or similar to my situation because I studied for 3 years in high school, just taking classes because I had to, not necessarily because I wanted to. And then I think what got me interested in the language was seeing another Spanish teacher talk with my Spanish teacher, and I think I just got jealous because of that. Like it felt like such a cool thing to do. So that's what originally motivated me to start learning the language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, my Spanish teacher is just a small point. It wasn't even Spanish. She was Portuguese.
Oh, so she
Uh,
still knew Spanish?
well, yeah, she also taught French as well, but I think she was native French and Portuguese, and then she just spoke Spanish. So, but I don't remember how good she was because obviously I didn't really speak it at all. And actually, all the lessons they just spoke in English the whole time, so we never really heard them speak Spanish anyway.
Right. That's still impressive. Yeah. Um, let's see here. So I guess when you started studying on your own, what were some of the methods that you used?
So when I started on my own when I left school, I first looked to the methods. Like I know like lots of people say this, but I looked to the methods that I used in school and I didn't really know any other way of doing it. But what I used was I used a website called Memrise, which is like a bit like with flashcards. And I found a bunch of decks that someone had made, and I basically went through, and I was like categorized by level. So it was like all this stuff that was basic. It was a few basic words, and then it was basic grammar structures, and then it went up. There was 9 different levels. I didn't even make it to the ninth one, but I started with the first one, obviously, and I got to like 5 or 6, I think, in a couple of months, which was quite a few different words and grammar patterns. Yeah, and so that was how I started. I didn't really know how to do it, but I was also, yeah, I think I wanted to actually speak, so I thought maybe I need to do something else. So what I did was, I don't know, I tried to imitate people in like songs and stuff because there were some songs I liked in Spanish, but that was the extent of it. I didn't really know what I was doing at all.
Well,
Mm.
it's good of you to try to output, or at least um, not necessarily try to output as in saying your own thoughts, but output as in getting the accent right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but obviously at that point, like I just started and I hadn't listened to the language at all, so my accent was completely rubbish. Um, what it must have been, I don't really have any audios or anything from that time, but I know for a fact that I couldn't pronounce half the sounds. I couldn't even do the strong Spanish R. Uh,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of how bad my pronunciation was. Like, do you know that intonation rule where if a word ends in N or S, then the pronunciation is one way, and if
I mean, like the stress.
yeah, so
Yeah, that's more for the writing rather than the pronunciation, because the writing reflects the language that you speak rather than the other way around. But yeah, so
yeah,
I know what you mean when you're reading something when you're starting, you didn't really know like where to put the accent.
yeah. I didn't realize that rule until maybe like 2.5 years in. So
Hmm.
I felt really embarrassed because like at 2.5 years in, I would have considered myself maybe like proficient, like B1, B2 level. But
Hmm.
then not knowing a rule as simple as that is just humbling.
So when do you mean that you didn't know the rule? So when you spoke, you didn't put the accent in the right place, or you didn't know the rule, so you didn't know how to write it?
Well, I should specify, I didn't really do much output at all. In fact, I think the very
Hmm.
first time I even outputted was 2 years in. Um,
Okay.
yeah, but I generally didn't speak that much, but still, nonetheless, I guess knowing that there was a rule as simple as that and then not knowing about it 2.5 years in
Mhm.
was felt very humbling.
Okay. For me, it's actually quite different because I would say that I didn't know that rule until a couple of years in either. But the fact that I had listened so much really helped me to. So I already pronounced it that way without thinking about it. And I knew how to, well, I'll go on to what methods I used later on. But I already pronounced fairly correctly with the stress before I knew how to actually apply that rule. Or I knew the rule kind of intuitively because I had read like books and things and I knew like when they put the accents on it or not. But I think that comes from like reading a lot when you start because when you read you don't really know like how to pronounce it. But if you hear the word and then you see it written, you can sort of kind of get an idea of how that's how it's pronounced before you try and write it. So yeah, for
Yeah.
me that rule more applies to when you're writing rather than when you're pronouncing. But of course, when you're trying to read something out loud, it can help you if you have a doubt of how something's pronounced.
Yeah, speaking of books, and you said you read a lot. What was some of the content and media that you used?
Okay, so I would definitely want to read more, but I never used any grammar books. I always use, well, I've looked up things online for grammar, but well, going back to the question with the books, it's about I mostly read like novels and uh, and also some non-fiction books. But I always read like authentic books. You know, when I started, when I started reading, I tried to choose easier ones. Yeah, I had a book that was for like a B1 level people, and then after that, I immediately tried to read like what would be light novels, so novels but not like high class literature, and uh, and now I can read most every anything I want. Um, but I definitely I prefer to read novels, and also later on I went on to listen to them as audiobooks.
Oh, that's so so you read it once and then listened to it as an audiobook.
Not for the same books.
Okay.
But I kind of progressed, and I realized that I could fit in more time listening to books rather than reading them as physical things. So I started listening to the books I wanted to rather than reading them, because I can do that while I'm walking somewhere or whatever. But it's
Yes.
the same idea, just trying
Yeah.
to get exposed to good quality language that is in like with lots of hard vocabulary that you will find in novels.
So, um, so you started reading books. So during that time, were you looking at any grammar books? Because this must have been after you finished school. So were you looking at any grammar books to help, while you're
Okay,
reading
so I
typing?
think it's important to go back to the start, because I didn't really start reading until a bit later on. As I said, I read this one book for like learners, but I would say that I didn't really read much other than perhaps some articles or short texts online until at least a year or maybe a year after I'd started learning, like by myself.
Okay.
So what I did mostly was listen.
Listening. So, and when you're coming across new words, did you have any way of trying to remember the words? Like, did you use flashcards or any system to try to remember them?
After that first period where I used flashcards, I never used them again. So what I do sometimes, if I come across a new word, well, it's different now than when I started. Because when I started, I come across a new word and I'd write it down on a piece of paper, and I'd leave that piece of paper somewhere that I could see it like the next day or later on in the day. But I didn't really have like a proper system with flashcards. No, I just tried to listen as much as I could, and I wrote down some words that I thought were important. But most of the time, when I wrote down the words, like it was just there for a couple of days, and I got rid of it, like on paper. I mean,
I've heard that writing something down with a pencil helps you remember it better than like typing it or any other way.
perhaps, yeah, I always wrote it down on paper. That's perhaps correct. I can't confirm, but because for most of the words I have learned, I haven't done that. I think. Um, that's more when I'm being more deliberate and I have like I sit down naturally, try and focus a lot more on what I'm listening to, and I would write down something if it's an important, if I think it's going to be an important word that I would like to remember.
Right. So aside from like diving straight into audiobook seems pretty tough. So was there any other listening materials that you used aside from audiobooks?
Yeah, so the audiobooks, as I said, came much later.
Okay.
I would never be able to start with that from the start. I definitely need when I started, as I said, I first had this period where I used flashcards, and then actually I went to on holiday to Spain for 1 week, but I didn't speak much at all there because as soon as I got there, um, like the taxi driver spoke to me in Spanish and I understood nothing. And
Yeah.
that was kind of the moment where I realized, oh, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Actually, before that, all I'd done was these flashcards, and then I'd taken one class on italki. So I tried to speak with someone and it was very broken, but I managed to get my point across, which I was happy with. But then when I went to Spain, I realized that I understood absolutely nothing of what they said to me. So I didn't speak through the whole week. I only spoke English and I didn't really, because I was in a very touristy area. But
Yeah.
after that, I decided to look for like different ways to learn, and I found this channel on which was called Dreaming Spanish.
I've heard about
If
that.
you've heard it.
Yeah.
So actually, I would say that that was the main resource I used when I started, because he has videos of different levels. Um, and basically it's comprehensible input, like he says, but doesn't have subtitles. You just listen, and he gives lots of actions and gestures and all that, what he's saying, and pictures. And I listened to that from that point. But obviously, I'd already done these flashcards a bit, so I think the flashcards actually did help at the start because I had some vocabulary to start with, so I wasn't just starting with comprehensible input, understanding nothing.
Right.
I had a lot of words, even though I was translating all the time, because I'd only learned it that way. I'd never listened. That helped me to use these videos of comprehensible input, and it definitely would have been a lot harder if I just started with them without having done the flashcards before that. But this channel, definitely helped me a lot. So I was listening to that. So not audiobooks, nothing too difficult. I was trying to find stuff that I could actually understand a good amount of. I didn't know, obviously, that was too important, but I got the idea that maybe if I'm listening to something I understand nothing, that can't be very useful.
Right.
So if I understand something, that's got to help me. And obviously on this channel as well, he talked about comprehensible input, and that sort of started me off on trying to improve my methods of learning.
Right.
And then, yeah, after that, I can say I looked for other channels for people that were teaching Spanish, and I always looked for ones that I was speaking Spanish in. So there was maybe some basic ones where they're explaining like grammar concepts, but everything in Spanish. So maybe for A to B1 level maximum. So I started off with that. Uh,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Focusing on listening is really important. And your story about the taxi driver not being able to understand anything that the taxi driver said reminds me of the time where I did like a let's see, after about 2 years of self study, I had this summer program that I went to, and there were about I don't know, like 7 or 8 Puerto Ricans there, and I tried listening to them, but I understood absolutely nothing because yeah, Puerto Rican Spanish is just like they speak English in Spanish. It's a completely different
Yeah,
yeah. So
I
that
would say
demotivated
that
me.
even now I have some trouble with them sometimes. So when you just, well, even if you're not used to it at all, if you never heard it, and of course maybe your listening wasn't as good as it is now, you would have had some trouble with that. But this was like I thought I learned a decent amount of Spanish, and I was really hopeful. I was like, oh, I'm going to Spain, I'm going to be able to practice. Then I get there, and they say one sentence to me, which probably wasn't even anything that difficult, and I understood nothing.
Yeah.
So it was like a big letdown. I was like, oh, what am I doing wrong? What's the issue here?
Yeah, exactly. So use Dreaming Spanish, which must have been very helpful. And what were your steps after, I guess, using Dreaming Spanish? Were there any other sources of content that you used?
So when I started there, I was using that channel, and as I said, I looked for other content on YouTube for learners. So, and I didn't want to listen to stuff in English because I knew now like listening is important. Listening is how I'm gonna improve at least a bit. So I looked for other channels always in Spanish, maybe explaining some concepts of grammar and vocabulary that I had trouble with. Not too much. I never really like looked for the rules. I always looked for something that was more comprehensible, just trying to understand like why someone used this and not that. Um, but then I think in that period of time, I realized that while I'm listening to all this stuff, I'm watching these videos, but it's all made for like learners. So what I really wanted to do, I don't know, like I actually took a couple of classes online at that point, and I realized that now I can actually speak a bit. So that was sort of like I did have output fairly early, but not too much. Like I would say I took 2 or 3 classes within a few months. Um, that was just because I wanted to see if I could speak at all, if anything was like actually in my head, anything was working. Uh, But then I decided that one of my goals would be to try and understand some actual videos made for native speakers, because it's like a big jump you might find between the videos made for learners at like B1 level and then people that are actually speaking at normal speed.
Right.
Like the easiest ones I would say like start at B2 level, but you can't really classify it. It's hard to classify. but I would say that there's definitely a jump. And so I thought if I can understand that, then I'd be doing quite well. So I would say, just give you a time frame. When I started with the flashcards, it was June of 2019, and I went to Spain at the beginning of September for the week. And then after that, I came back and I started university in October. But when I'd started university, I got motivated to study more myself. So that and during that period there was when I was starting to uh, increase the like to listen to and watch these videos. And
Yeah.
then 3 or 4 months after that, coming towards Christmas or January, I don't remember exactly when, was when I realized that when I listened to or watched a video made for natives, I could actually understand some of what they were saying. Of course, it was very difficult, but I realized that, oh, maybe it's possible for me to understand this because depending on the video, it was like some probably basic ones talking about, I don't even remember, but some not very difficult subjects. And I was like, oh, I don't understand a lot of this, but I can understand some of it. So I must be doing something right now. And this was
Right.
like 3 or 4 months after I'd started to listen myself, which was like a big achievement for me at the time.
So,
Mhm.
yeah. So around how many hour or might not have been hours, but how long were you studying? Assumingly, or I'm assuming you're studying every day. So how long were you studying every day?
Yeah, actually, when I found the channel Dreaming Spanish, one of the things he said was to be consistent. So I decided that I wanted to study every day. Um, But as I said, I was also starting university at that time, so I didn't have too much time. But what I had was I decided to dedicate a period of time every morning to doing it. And that varied day to day. Sometimes it was just 15, 20 minutes. But other days, if I had less on, maybe I would do a lot more and I would actually spend a few hours. So, but I would say it would average to 1 or 2 hours a day over and that period of time, but more on the lower side, more closer to 1 hour probably. And it's really hard to say because, as I said, it depended on how much time I had on that particular day. Like when I didn't have time, I my main focus was to do something in Spanish in that on that day, even if it was just watch one video from this channel. Uh,
Okay.
but then when I had more time, I definitely spent more on it. But yeah, I didn't really count at all. The main thing was just to spend time every day, even if it was just a little bit.
Yeah, it's good to stay consistent, and sometimes sometimes you might feel like nothing's in your brain. Like if you're walking out somewhere or driving, you think, is learning a foreign language even possible? Like, is this stuff even in my brain? But then you come back and then it's there.
Okay. Yeah, there's something interesting about that because one of the things I do other than language learning is I do lots of running. So with running, since I was 15 years old, I run pretty much every day. So I do 6 or 7 days a week. Um, and that would probably help me to be able to be dedicated to something doing it every day because I already had this habit that I did every day. And actually, when I started listening and learning, I realized that when I was running, because I never listened to music, I prefer to just think. I had like these random words in Spanish in my head
Yeah.
when I was running, um, and I was yeah, that was kind of surprising. But then I can't remember who it was, but there was a video that told me that that means that you're actually learning something. So even if you're not actually thinking properly, you just have these random words that you've spent or that you've heard during the day or during one of the videos. You just have them in your head. That means you're actually acquiring the language. But that was later on when I realized that. But one of the things that I wanted to do at the start, which took me a while, was to try and think directly in Spanish. Because so when I was running on almost every day, I'd spend some time like listening before that, and then I went for a run and I was trying to think in the language, think in Spanish for a couple of minutes, and it gradually got easier and easier. And I'm not sure if it was because I was trying to, or if it was just because I was getting better by listening.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, trying to think out like by yourself in the language directly was one of the hardest things. But as you said, when you're walking around, sometimes you're unsure if you're actually learning. But that helped me to realize how maybe something is happening.
Yeah, that's it's really a good sign that random words are appearing in your head. Have you ever tried listening to any podcasts or something while you're running?
Uh, I've done that, but I preferred not to. One of the things that I do, I never really run with my phone. Uh, so I prefer to just run and have a clear head. But there's definitely been some times where I have gone with the podcast. That was I haven't done that since near the start of my learning. There was a podcast I liked, which was actually called SpanishPodcast.net. Uh,
Okay.
but uh, but yeah, that was just like occasionally. The main thing I did was just run without anything, without any music or anything, because it's like a form of meditation as well. But that uh, I didn't really think much about that. I just thought, oh, I prefer to just try and clear my head.
Yeah, it's good to, I guess, study and then let your mind clear for a little bit and see what's still there.
Yeah, exactly. And
So,
I
go ahead.
oh, go on. Right. So when I was, for example, when I was studying for my exams at the end of school, what I did was when I went running, I try and think about the concepts that or the things I'd been revising, and that helped me to like get my thoughts in order and to understand better the stuff. So that was where that came from later on, me trying to do it in Spanish because I'd already sort of done that with my school subjects, trying to understand like the concepts in physics or whatever.
That's great. So, I guess used Dreaming Spanish and well, flashcards at the beginning, then some Dreaming Spanish, and how many years in would you say that you reached quote unquote fluency or proficiency?
It's very hard to say because as I said, when I did do output fairly early on. I know you said waited a few years even before doing any output, and you still haven't done too much. Perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, but um, I started fairly early with the output, but I wasn't focused on it at all. So it was just because I enjoyed like speaking a bit occasionally. And actually, at university, we had like this language exchange group, but I was always speaking with other learners. But that was like not too much at all, maybe once every few weeks. And I realized even then, even though I'd only been learning for a few months, that my Spanish was always already as like as good as lots of the other people that were there because they had learnt it in school. Most of the people there had just learnt it in school and then were just interested in continuing now they were university. But me, I'd actually done the majority myself after in those few months. I'd say after a few months, I definitely progressed a lot more than even in the 2 years than that I studied in school. And I realized that my level was already, I could already have conversation or speak almost as fluently as the other people, but it was very broken. And it's hard to say when exactly I would consider myself fluent, but I say yeah, after 6 to 8 months, I could definitely have a decent conversation, but this was maybe I wouldn't even consider myself quite a B2 level at that point. I would say I was a B1, but I could have fairly decent conversations.
That's
But
great.
it depends on your definition of fluency because for me, that was just having a conversation. So I would consider that a conversational level, whereas I hesitated a lot, but I could generally get my point across with basic subjects. Uh, so if you consider that fluency, then that's it. But me, I prefer that. I would say I wouldn't consider myself fluent, and yeah, I wouldn't have even said I spoke Spanish. I would say I was learning Spanish at that point. It was
Right.
only like a year and a half or 2 years after I'd started where I would actually comfortable be saying that I spoke Spanish, uh, because I
Yeah.
never really knew what that meant. So I was like, when I speak Spanish, someone's going to talk to me and they're going to just speak really fast, assuming I know everything. So I never wanted to say I spoke
Yeah.
Spanish.
Imposter
But then I got
syndrome.
to a level where I was fairly comfortable that I could understand what they were saying, even if they spoke to me with a decent speed. But that was like a couple of years after I started. So that's when I was comfortable to say I spoke Spanish. But of course, there's lots of different levels of fluency, at least I consider. it's really hard to say when exactly. There's no day exactly where I realized, oh, maybe now I actually am fluent. No.
Okay. So, at what point did you realize that, well, after you got fluent, what point did you realize that your Spanish was actually pretty good?
Um, well, actually, talking about the after the it was probably 10 months after I'd started, what I decided I'm not sure why I liked the pronunciation side and the accent side of things, but I was side that interested me because I thought, oh, I don't want to sound like a typical learner that just has a bad accent. Like, because I had a very strong, well, I'm not sure. I'd always tried to speak with a good accent, but I never like knew what to do. So I was just trying to imitate as best I could. So of course I had a British accent when I spoke. And I decided the 10 months after that I wanted to take a few classes of pronunciation, so more deliberate practice on italki. And I found um, a, a like a teacher on italki that was specialized in that. And that was when I wanted to study the pronunciation or to learn a bit more about pronunciation and accent to improve. And when I spoke with him, he said that accent was my pronunciation was already really good, uh, and that this was a very experienced teacher who taught many people, and he said that it was one of the like usually when people come to him, it's because they have lots of issues with their pronunciation. Whereas I vaguely pronounced everything correctly, even though I had a fairly strong accent, that like no one had trouble understanding what I wanted to say, even if I had an accent like quite strong. And I couldn't pronounce all the sounds like the strong R, I couldn't pronounce at that point still. But when I started that, I realized, oh, maybe I can actually speak quite well. I already have a decent pronunciation and I can get my point across quite well. Like all these lessons, we're talking about pronunciation on this concept, and it was all in Spanish. So I would say then I realized maybe I'm actually all right.
Oh, so the teacher was talking to you in Spanish.
Yeah, he was teaching me the pronunciation in Spanish, like the pronunciation of Spanish, but everything in Spanish. Like we were speaking, we had like a hour long lessons. It was an hour, and then there was half an hour after that each time. But he was correcting me and being very precise with different instructions, so I understood most perfectly what he was saying. And he was all in Spanish. And obviously, as I said, that well, I don't know how true it was because my accent wasn't perfect when I got there, but it was definitely, I pronounced very well already when I started to do this. And he was surprised because most people that came to him were actually having lots of difficulties, whereas for me it was more that I wanted to get to the next level with my pronunciation. And for me, that was something that I thought describe or that would allow me to show how someone that spoke well was someone that had a good accent. Not It's not the only defining factor, but I thought that for me that was something that was important. So the fact that he already thought that I could already pronounce well and no one really had problems understanding what I wanted to say was already a good sign.
Yeah, it's really good to focus on your accent. So, would you say that his classes helped you with your accent, or was it already good enough to where his teaching didn't really help you that much?
No, I would say that it helped me out quite a lot because before that I didn't really like I knew I wanted to speak with a good pronunciation and pronounce well, but to have this more deliberate approach where I actually learned, oh, this is the sounds I knew. He told me all the sounds that I was pronouncing differently to how they should be. So initially, the most important thing to correct was the vowels for him, which I agree with now. So the vowels, like some of them are like the ah is the same in at least British English and Spanish. So I didn't have a problem with that. But the two hardest ones were like what would be the e and the o, which for an English speaker we have tendencies to use different sounds that are very close to that, and those sounds don't exist. It's very difficult for us. So just being able to bring my attention to the sounds that I didn't pronounce correctly. And there were lots of things that I realized after that that it basically taught me to be aware of my pronunciation and how we're pronouncing the sounds. To later go on and correct it myself, even after the classes, because I took his classes like once a week for maybe 5, 6 weeks. So during that time, I improved my pronunciation a decent amount, but it wasn't like I suddenly was perfect with an accent or whatever. No, that
Okay.
it just really helped me become aware of my own pronunciation, and I know that that really helped me later on as I'm listening, and I realize, oh, they're pronouncing it like that. I know how to like get closer to that. I know how to correct myself now, which was mainly the point of the lessons that he taught me. So it was more about awareness
Okay.
of things.
Is since your accent is so good, is maintaining it or improving it something that's part of your daily routine?
Um, I would say now I don't like I want to do more deliberate practice in Spanish. I want to sit down and practice. Uh, but the only time that I would say that would be dedicated to improving or maintaining it would be that I read out loud. And at the moment, I'm not even doing that every day because I'm quite busy. But when I can, I read out loud in Spanish, and that definitely helps me to maintain it because on the days when I'm not speaking with someone in a conversation, then reading out loud helps. And even to because when you're in a conversation, you don't have time to focus on your own accent. So it allows me to relax and to get to focus on how I'm pronouncing stuff. So that would be the only practice that I do now to try and improve or maintain my accent. And I would say that the only way I can really improve now is to be more comfortable with, generally more comfortable, because sometimes when I'm speaking a bit quicker, some it gets mixed up, but I don't know how to explain it, but it's not that I like if I see a word by itself, I read the word like by itself, or I say it by itself, I almost never have a problem, uh, and I can pronounce it like very, very well, not like a native speaker would. But when I'm speaking generally, of course, there's times where I slip up, and that's just a question of more practice and being more comfortable.
Yeah, and I I did watch your video of you speaking Spanish, and I didn't really notice you slipping up that much because your filler words were already that good. Like almost exactly how a native would use them.
Mhm. With the filler words, yeah, I'd say I'm quite good with that. Actually, I would say that's because I knew it was something that was important. I've never tried to artificially use filler words myself, but just by force of listening to people watching actually films, I didn't watch them from the start, but later on now I've watched quite a few films and series, and just almost trying to imitate how like native speakers act and use the filler words. Um, for me, that's changed a lot, and I understand like why they're used, uh, and now I can use them myself. And I think as I go on, they get gradually more unconscious for me.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
yeah, like I don't really think I just use the filler words as I would in English without thinking about them, which sometimes is a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. But yeah, I get gradually more used to just using them without thinking. But at the start, I used them to help me when I made pauses more than anything. But I never tried to artificially force myself to use ones that I wasn't really sure about. I was always trying to, well, in general in the language, I always try and use the words that I'm sure about. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. If you want, I can go on. I can go into more detail on that point because it's something that I find really interesting. Um,
Yeah,
so,
go
for
ahead.
example, when we're speaking a language, one of the most common things is to use stuff from our own native language. But I would say as we go on, well, during my whole time learning, what I've tried to do is use the stuff that I know already in Spanish, So my idea with when I'm speaking Spanish is that I use the structures and stuff that I'm familiar with in Spanish, which is more limited than my English, but as I improve it, it gets more, it broadens. So what I never try and use an expression, or if I'm unsure about something, like for example, there are expressions and words that sometimes just pop into my head and I don't know if they're good or not. But I would generally not use them unless I'm speaking to someone that I know where I can ask for feedback. So I would use that and I would say, oh, is this correct? And often it is correct, sometimes it's not, but often it is. And it's something that I'd never thought about. But I'm very aware of like the things that I'm sure of and not sure of in the language in terms of structures. And the errors I make, I can pretty much correct all of them by listening back. Uh, because they're just small slip ups rather than actual like errors ingrained into my language.
Right.
So you're just the idea of trying to use what you know rather than trying to uh, speak really eloquently and try and use all these different or try and translate almost because sometimes we want to express an idea that we have in our head that's more complex, but I think it's important to accept that we're not going to be able to express the ideas in as complex of a way, at least until you get to a certain point in the language. So for me, it was just okay. I'm trying to simplify what's the idea, what's the general gist of what I want to say, and then I'll try and put that into terms that I know well in Spanish. So that way I can speak more correctly and without being unsure. And then trying to expand where I can the words and stuff I can use is either by asking for correction or while I'm listening, I come across something and I'm like, oh wow, I could use that, and I say that's something I understand that I want to use. So it's something I'm sure of, but I don't use it, so I know that when I go to speak in a conversation, I will be able to, or maybe a situation will come up that I want to use it. Um, and actually, there are words and expressions I know that I'm almost waiting for the correct moment to use them because I haven't found it yet, or they're like something an expression I really like, but I'm not going to be able to force myself to use it unless the right situation arises.
Right. Yeah. Is there so if you ever is there if there's something in Spanish that you want to express but you don't know how to express, do you just wait and hope and try to find it, or do you try to find a good English translation?
Do you mean when I'm having a conversation with someone?
I mean, if you're like if you're listening to content, or actually, no, I should rephrase this. So if there's maybe you're speaking English and there's this concept that you want to be able to express, would you like look it up in Spanish, or would you just let the word come to you in Spanish, if you know what I mean?
Okay, so for example, when I'm speaking in English with someone and I come across something and I think, oh, do I know how to say that in Spanish? Do
Yeah.
I know how to express that? Yeah, that sometimes happens. Sometimes when I'm having a conversation, or even when I'm just thinking by myself. When I'm thinking by myself, I often do this. I often think, uh, I have an expression in my head, or I've said something in English. Do I know how to express this idea in Spanish? And then sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And if I don't, then I can look it up.
Okay.
So as I said, this is works well with when I'm running, for example. So I'm running and I'm thinking the whole time. And I come back and there's a few different ideas that I have in my head that I now want to look up how to say in Spanish because I wasn't able to think about them. I had to like paraphrase, or I
Yeah.
couldn't find the precise way to express it in Spanish. But yeah, now I would say that I, well, for me, that's the fluency. That's somewhat related to the definition of fluency. Because now I have no problem really expressing almost any idea. Of course, with some ideas that are more complex, I will hesitate more and I won't be able to be as precise. But for example, if there's a word I don't know, like for me, fluency is being able to work around that and being able to use other ways to explain it to get your point across, even if it's not the most precise way to do it. Yeah.
That's a
So
good
now I
definition
don't
of
really
it.
have the same problem about being able to express the idea. It's more about, oh, is there a better way to say this?
Yeah, that's great. That's a good definition of fluency. It's not necessarily knowing everything, but I guess knowing alternate paths to the same sort of idea.
Yeah. And for example, like I said, oh no, I don't think I said it yet, but there's ideas that you want to express in the other language, and what you want to do is you can't really just translate directly most of the time. You want to know how the native speakers express that same idea. So what you try to do is say, oh, how do I express this idea in the language? And when I express it, is that the way a native speaker would express it? And if not, then what is? Like, I need to look it up. Um,
Yeah, that's
so
good.
yeah, it's definitely always trying to sound to be natural with how you're expressing ideas. And of course, for example, you might not be able to express an idea that you want, but you can probably express an idea that's very similar that will allow you to get your point across.
Okay, yeah, that's good. So now that you're pretty good at Spanish, what would you say that your daily routine is to keep up your level?
So actually, it's a bit particular for the past couple of months because now I am actually in. I've moved to France for the year. Um, and in France, even though I've been, well, that's another thing that I'm also learning French, but it's not as good as my Spanish. But this is an interview about Spanish, so I'll stay there. But the point is that I'm in France, and actually here there's lots of exchange students from Spain, from mostly from Spain, but from some Latin American countries as well. So I've actually made a couple of friends, and my daily routine, I don't really have a daily routine of studying Spanish. What I do is I spend as much time, well, I watch or listen to whatever I want to because I have some channels I like or some podcasts I like. And whenever I have time, I listen to those. And if not, I am speaking actually almost every day with someone in Spanish, which is exceptional because before I came here, I never had the opportunity to do that every day or almost every day.
Right.
So for me now, I have less need to try and upkeep my level by lots of listening and reading. Of course, it's still important, and I fit it in as much as I can. But I am almost every day I have contact with the language without trying uh, here. So that's mainly. I don't really have a fixed daily routine at the moment. But before, I was definitely trying to spend as much time passively listening and reading as much as I could. And on some days, I would try and sit down and do more focused study, maybe for half an hour.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good that you can speak every day. It's really important to have a solid active vocabulary.
Yeah, yeah. As I said, this is something that I never had before. So now I'm just getting to know like whether it's some because obviously I could speak well before I came here even, but I'd say that I've my fluency is definitely improving since I've been here. Because before I could speak pretty well, but I couldn't just jump into a conversation and be completely comfortable. Like sometimes it took a bit of time for me to get used to it. And then on the days where I'd spent more time in Spanish, or I'd spoken for a longer period of time, then I would definitely get more comfortable, more fluent. Or weeks where I'd spend more time uh, with the language, that would be the times where I'd be more fluent and more comfortable with it. But now I have this almost every day, and it's something that's just there. And like someone speaks to me in Spanish, I can jump in and just immediately uh, start speaking Spanish fairly well.
That's great. So since your speaking is so good, if you might have seen this hierarchy that I have on my channel of um, reading, listening, writing, and speaking. So would you say that out of all four of those, would your speaking be the best, and what would be the worst?
I would say out of the four of them, it's hard to say between reading and listening, but my opinion is that to have a, I would consider that my listening is better than my reading, because to have a good level of reading, you need to be like even better than, you can't just listen and read the same thing. And if you can understand it in both times, then doesn't mean you have the same level in reading and listening. For me, like, you need to be able to be much better with your reading. But I would also say that it's more natural that the you find it easier to read than to listen, because especially in Spanish, where you can always tell how something's pronounced. Um, like everything that I can listen to, I can read, and I can read more or more easily. But I would still class my listening to be better than my reading as a competence. And I would say that speaking comes third. So listening, reading, speaking, and then writing last, because I hardly ever practice my writing. So when I'm writing, this is something that I've thought about recently. I want to spend more time deliberately practicing my writing and maybe improving that aspect, but I never really do any of that. So like I can write perfectly correctly with like the orthography, and I can write as I'm speaking, and even I can express myself better in writing because you have time to reorder and to put your thoughts in the correct way on the paper. But I would say that I speak better than I write, because I never practice it. Uh,
I kind of find that hard to believe because that email you sent me was really good.
but for example, when I sent you an email like that, um, I'm just writing as I would say the words. I didn't change anything from what I would have just said.
Okay.
Like, whereas what I'm talking about is maybe more long form writing. If I'm trying to write what would be an essay or something like that, then I would definitely maybe struggle more with trying to get my point in a very concise, coherent way than I would when I'm just speaking. Because speaking, you have a bit more leeway, you have a bit more, like, is a bit more relaxed with how you can express your ideas, because you're generally going to stop mid-sentence, rephrase, and change around, because that's how people speak. Because you can't just, unless you've prepared something, you can't just speak off the cuff and say exactly what you want. You always have to go back and correct things and
Right.
use maybe some structures that be weird in writing, because you're just thinking as you're going. Whereas in writing, to really write well with an essay, like, I would say, I couldn't write anything like a very high level in Spanish. Like, I can write well, but I know I could definitely improve. And I class my speaking higher than that, because maybe it's more closer to someone of my age, and as in, like, more closer to a native speaker than my writing is to the writing of a native speaker. Of course, there's still a big gap, but I mean, like, in terms of if it's closer or not.
Yeah. It's really, it's still impressive how at least natural your writing is. Like I had to do um, on Reddit. There's a specific subreddit called I think r/write streak, and I use that every once in a while to get feedback on my writing. But still, you barely practiced it at all, and you still have that good at writing. That's so impressive.
Okay, so for example, with the writing, I would say for everything that's orthography, how do you pronounce it in English?
Yeah.
But yeah, with that, I have no problem because of a method I used, but this was not to train my writing. It kind of helped at the same time, but it was mostly to train my listening. So what it was a sort of transcription method. I don't know
Transcription.
if you transcription, like,
Okay.
I'm listening to a video and I write down what I'm hearing, and then I correct it based on the subtitles afterwards. Like, I don't look at the subtitles the first time, and I go back as many times as I need to try and understand what they said and be able to write it down. So this was something I used a lot. I haven't used it recently, but in the first year or so of my learning, this really helped me improve my listening. And of course, as a side thing, I was correcting the spelling and the accents and stuff on the words. So I that's why I didn't really need to know this rule about the accentuation when I started, because I just knew intuitively where to put the accents, because I would always hear it and then I would correct where I'd done it on the words. Of course, sometimes I still had doubts before knowing this rule because that just really helps you clear things up. But I never really needed it to write. But as I said with my writing, um, I think that writing skills can probably transfer across languages because I never really write in, like, of course, the thing that doesn't transfer is the vocabulary and that. But as I've read a lot, then I have a fairly wide vocabulary. And
Yeah.
and also, if I was writing to someone on a text and I didn't know a word, I would always look it up. But I have less need for that now. But for example, with the writing of a long form, then you have time to rearrange stuff. And I think that obviously that's something I do in university as well in English. So the methods you use to correct and to rearrange your ideas are the same between different languages. The only thing that changes is the actual structures and vocabulary that you're using. So I think for me, if you can speak well, then you can, or if you can speak without making too many errors, then you can write fairly well because you can just write as you're saying. Especially in the case of a language like Spanish, where the writing is very natural, like you don't have to worry about spelling. Um, and then the only thing that changes is the fact that you want to be able to rearrange your ideas and to speak fairly well, and maybe to change between different registers to speak or to write more formally. But also when I'm speaking, for me, it's slightly difficult still, but to be able to speak in a more colloquial way in certain situations and a more formal way in other situations. But I think if you can do that when you're speaking, then you can also do that when you're writing. But the main thing is also the awareness of the words that you're using, whether they're formal or informal, that can help you. And as I said, to be able to, these basic techniques of restructuring your ideas that you would use in English or your native language anyway. But as I said, writing is not something I've really focused on, so I'm not sure like how. I think the only way I'd go about improving it is trying to write long form things and then get feedback. Um,
That technique of transcribing what you're listening to is kind of genius because instead of writing the incorrect way and then having it corrected, you're just writing it the correct way on the first time.
okay, yeah, so that is not actually my method, so I can't take credit for it.
Okay.
But it's something I can't remember where I first found out about it. But I know that the polyglot Luca Lampariello, he's definitely used this method before, and I've seen that on his channel. But I don't think it was from there that I originally got the idea. Um, but for me, that was mostly to train my listening, as I said, and I think that that tool is definitely to like the two things that you get from it is training your listening and training your orthography, the way you write stuff, like the spelling and the accentuation in the case of Spanish. But it doesn't really help you express your ideas in writing. It just allows you to be able to write at like the same level you can speak basically because you would know how the words go onto a page.
Right.
But yeah, like the reason why this is so strong for listening, in my opinion, and I actually really noticed a difference doing this for a couple of months very consistently. This was near when I started. When I started trying to listen to or watch videos in native level, what I found that when there's certain things that you don't understand, that you might understand if you read it, but you don't understand it because someone says it in a certain way, like they compress all the sounds together, or uh, they don't pronounce it as clearly as when it's in writing. Because in writing, if you know the words and the grammar, you can understand the sentence, but maybe the same sentence when it's spoken, you might have trouble with it. Now I don't. Of course, with certain accents, I might, but no, I don't. But mostly because of this method, and that method allows you to. I would say one of the best things about that method is if you can read well already, then that would definitely bump your listening up a massive amount because you already know all these words and you already know all these this grammatical structures. So when you go to all you need is to be able to understand it when someone's saying it. And for example, when someone's saying something like in Spanish, one of the things that I realized from using this method is, for example, when they have different vowels or when they have the same vowels between multiple words, and they bring them all into one, or compress them into similar things. So they don't separate all the words, and the vowels kind of all they all mix in together into one vowel. For example, if you have the like three E in a row, like three E's in a row, but they're all in different words, then they would become just one sound. So, for example, when someone says, uh, what's a good example of that? With like the me he dicho me hablado, you wouldn't say all the I can't remember a good example with the past participle that starts with an E, but they would all join together and like the E's. So you didn't say me, you would say me when you're
Mm.
speaking quickly. It would all come together. And for example, if you know how to read something like that, it's not intuitive that that's the way it's said in the language. Uh, like that's the way it's that spoken, that sentence. And so that allows you to become really aware of like the shortcuts people take when they're speaking and to be able to understand people when they speak quicker even if they like of course when someone's speaking quicker than me there's two problems because you might understand everything if it was written down or you might just not understand the words, but so this trains the first one. This trains the one where you would already understand it if it was written down, and you would always and you would just transfer that to be able to understand it when you're listening as well. And of course as you're doing this, as you're listening and transcribing, there might be a phrase or a few words that you won't get. You're like, what did they say? But then what you do is you take your time. So the other benefit of this method is that you're forcing yourself to slow down with your listening. Because, for example, you might listen to a video and you understand the gist of what's going on, but you don't understand absolutely everything. So what this allows you to do is realize what parts are you understanding, what parts are you not, even if overall you get the general idea. This allows you to go from that to understanding absolutely everything that is there. So you have a video, you might be comfortable listening to it. So you might be like a B2, you might be a B2 level already, and you listen to this video, and so you understand the whole the whole video, the idea of what the person's saying, you understand their arguments, but there's going to be lots of little words there that you missed that you missed out, that you don't understand really.
Right.
So you just skipped over because you're just trying to understand the overall. So this method forces you to slow down and realize, because you have to write every single word down that you're hearing. You're like, you first of all you find these parts where you don't know what they said, and it's just because it's some method they use when they're speaking. And you also find these other areas, you find these words that you thought you might have knew or you skipped over if you were just listening to the video normally, and it allows you to find like the gaps in your knowledge and to really like boost up your comprehension to from 80 to 100% already, or 80 to 95%.
Yeah, I'm starting to think that me watching videos at 1.5x speed isn't a good idea.
Oh yeah, I was actually surprised when you said that in your video. I heard about it. For example, I would say that it depends, but for me, it's generally a bad idea because, but the main problem with it is not that you might have trouble understanding it. Like, I would put a video in 1.5 times speed in English if I want to get over with it quicker and I understand it well at 1.5 speed, 1.5 times speed even. But in Spanish, well, when you put something in general at 1.5 times speed, that distorts like how people were pronouncing and saying the words, and it doesn't really have the same intonation, the same flow as natural speech when you speed the audio up. So you lose that, and you lose like the benefit of improving how yourself would speak, like maybe your accent. I think
Right.
because for the accent, the most important thing other than deliberate practice is to listen a lot. And if you're listening at 1.5 times speed to slightly distorted audio, that can not be very good for knowing how people actually speak in reality. Uh,
Right.
yeah, if you're just interested in the information and you understand it well, then that's when you would put it in 1.5 times speed. But I never do that when I'm listening to Spanish or another thing. And I think in general, there are some videos that or some podcasts that even now that if I put them in 1.5 times speed, I would have trouble understanding them because it's just not supposed to be like that quick.
Right.
And it distorts how everything is said. It's like listening to someone over the phone because you lose some of the sounds, you lose some of the. It's not exactly the same, but if you're talking to someone on the phone, you don't hear everything. It's like, I don't know, I think a better analogy is if you're listening to someone or you're trying to talk to someone and you have a lot of noise in the background,
Right.
so you're not going to understand as much as normally, but you might understand, but it'll be more difficult and it's distorted, so you won't really know exactly how it's supposed to be said normally anyway.
Okay, I see. So since your comprehension and listening and reading skills must be really good. So are there any domains or areas of the language that you've pretty much mastered?
In terms of that, you mean
Like
with the
sports, like
vocabulary?
food, sports, like certain like math too. Certain areas like that where you're good or are not that good at.
So I would say in general, when I listen to some like on the videos and things I listen to, so it's hard to say if I've mastered something, but for me, I would say that one of the areas I'm best at is the casual spoken language. So
Okay.
that I can consider as a domain in itself, I think, because it's very different to when you're listening to like a lecture or something that might be from a university. But there's one I have actually also done some um, like with those domains. It's really hard to say specific domains because it's not the way I've sort of learned a language.
Okay.
Um, and the idea is, for example, my what I study at university is electrical engineering. So of course I'm going to be able to speak about that better in Spanish than economics, but that's the same as in English. Of
Right.
course, it's definitely going to be harder for me to explain it in Spanish because well the main difficulty is that I don't know how they express how they like the vocabulary in that area. A lot of it you can guess, but it's really hard to have it in your active vocabulary if you're not practiced speaking about that thing. So
Not good
most of
loan
the words
words.
I recognize them and I know them, but I don't know how to precisely explain. But it's generally the things more related to what I can do. Like I never really focused on specific domains when listening. I've always just gone for what I'm interested in. And I'd say that now I don't really have any trouble with the casual conversations, casual spoken language, even in a group of people, uh, in a fairly noisy environment. I've recently realized, oh, well, my comprehension is even very good in this situation. Uh, and I can understand very well films and series that are not on a very, for example, there are some more specialized ones that would be using lots of economic terms or something very specialized that I'm sure I would have more trouble with. But films and series in general, I understand very well. But domains, in terms of specific domains, is mostly what I'm interested in. I'm better at because that's what I listen to and that's what I read about.
Uh,
But
yeah.
general stuff, for example, as I said, when I read, I mostly read novels. That helps you with everyday vocabulary more than anything. And that the two things people say normally, you read books and the books are going to give you all these weird expressions and words. Uh, for example, there are lots of words and things that are only used in novels, but I would say that the majority of words that you're going to come across are actually words that you would use in normal day-to-day life, but they're just not as common. Um,
Right.
so that helps me to broaden my vocabulary and to, for example, know how to say different household items and know how to do that because I never learn them in like a list. I always learn them from reading or from just randomly hearing them in videos. But of course, in videos and like that, they're more common in novels because they're telling a story and they're describing different environments. So there's something you don't come across as much in videos. So my solution to that is either, well, as I said, it's a bit different now that I actually get the chance to speak with native speakers on almost daily. But before, I know these words because I've read them in a novel. Um, but yeah, I wouldn't go to focus on I wouldn't focus on domains that are not really related to my interest. And I know that if someone spoke about those sort of things to me in a very technical way, I wouldn't understand. But that's similar to in English because, of course, you have to speak to someone that's in that domain differently to someone that's outside of it. But if they spoke to me as if I was a native speaker, but there wasn't a native speaker that was in that domain, then I would understand most of everything they say. Um,
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about the language, not in terms of domains, but um, thinking about it in terms of your interests, because like there's lots of terms in English that you wouldn't even know. So, what's the point of trying to what's the point of trying to master something in Spanish if you don't even know how to express it in your native language?
Yeah, that was one of the things that I noticed in your video, and I noticed a lot of people commented about it as well. The fact that you deliberately go out of your way to learn them, or to well, maybe not learn them to become part of your active vocabulary, but just like the names of flowers, just to know that
Yeah.
they're flowers or things like that. Um, and that they were things you wouldn't even know in English. So maybe you can explain your mindset, your reasoning for trying to do that, because I would really be interested in knowing that.
Yeah, so let's talk about flowers for a minute. So if you hear the name like poppy, or actually maybe not, I can't remember the name for it in English, but if you hear any flower name, you know that it's a flower. But like
Mhm.
I'm not a biologist. I don't know what it looks like or anything specific about that. But
Right.
just the knowledge that it is a flower helps me with the story, as opposed to like coming across the word and not knowing what it is.
Okay. I understand your reasoning, but I would say this is one of the points where I'm not completely in agreement, because I would say that most of the times when you come across words like that you understand that it's a flower or it's a plant from context. So you don't really need to have come across it before. And of course, that's how you know the words in English, because maybe you learned them in biology in school, but you don't remember what they look like or anything.
Right.
But most of the flowers that you know because you've come across them and someone talking about them at some point in your life. So I would say that that's my approach to doing the same thing with Spanish, that you come across these words as you go along, and most of the time, the context will allow you to understand them without needing to come across them before.
Yeah, that's a good point. It kind of is. It's a little bit of a waste when I know that uh, the context can tell me, but I guess it's more of a like an instant gratification thing where I want to know immediately what the word is.
So
Yeah.
for these words, when you come across, do you use flashcards for them, or do you just write them down and try and remember that they're a flower or whatever?
No, I always use flashcards, Anki flashcards.
Okay. Because for me, what I do, if I come across a word like that in a book, um, the if it's obvious from the context that it's a flower or it's a tree, then I won't even bother to look it up, or I might look up a picture
Right.
just to confirm my suspicions. But most of the time, I don't look up all the words if I understand it from the context. But if it's a word that really stops me understanding what I need to do, like the whole sentence or the whole idea the thing they're trying to do, I will look it up. And I usually look first on the dictionary of the Spanish language.
So
Uh,
if you come
so
across, oh, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I'll get to probably what you're about to say. That I come across a word like sauce. which is a type of tree, which is a willow tree. I know that now because it's quite a common tree. So it's one of the ones that I've come across a lot of times in, you talk about, I don't know how to say it, but you talk about like a weeping willow, for example. So it's a type of it. It's a very distinctive tree. So that's why I know that it's that specific tree. But most of the time, these sort of words, I can't even, they're not part of my active vocabulary. I wouldn't be able to come out with them like that. But I would understand because what I do is I come across it and I either understand by the context that it's a tree or a flower, or if I don't, I look it up and then it tells me the translation in English. I recognize that it's a tree or a flower, or either the definition and then the like a picture or the translation. Then understand it's a tree or flower. I'm like, okay, I'm not bothered about which one it is exactly. So I'm just going to try and remember it's a tree or a flower. And it's not something that I really need to know. So I'm not going to even write it down. I'm just going to try and remember that it's that. And if I read enough or if it's a common enough word, I will come across it more. But as it's not something that's really important to me, like, and it's not really ever going to be important to me, I think I don't need to, I'm not going to put in the effort to make a flashcard, or I don't use flashcards, but I'm not going to put in the effort to write it down and to try and remember exactly. I would just think to myself, okay, that's a tree, I'll move on. And then I
Okay.
come to it the next time. Half of the time, maybe, I don't know how much of the time, like a lot of the time, I would remember that it's a tree or a plant, or I would think, oh, I've seen this before somewhere, what was it? And then I might have to look it up again, or I might not. And then, of course, that's just like a more natural form of, well, it's like natural space repetition. You come across it more, you're going to remember it. And with those sort of words that are less common, as I said, I'm not too bothered about them because I know that I would often understand them from the context anyway. So I don't make the effort to learn them specifically. But I would say that if you come across something like that in a situation where if someone's made a joke about that or you have some more emotions related to it, then you're much more likely to remember it even just from the first time.
Right.
So, like someone told me this expression, let's see if I can remember it. Cada mochuela su olivo, or something like that, which is, I think I messed up on the word for it, but it's a type of bird, goes back to the olive tree, and it means like each person goes back home. So it's like everything comes to an end eventually. So I remember the word for mochuelo, which is a type of bird. I don't know what bird it is in English, but I
Oh,
remember this because it's an
I
expression, and because I know someone. The reason I learned this was because someone told me in person. This was in a specific, um, in a specific situation. Someone told me, "Oh, do you know this expression?" Told me the expression, and I was like, "No, I don't know it, but I can get like this sort of idea." And I asked what mochuelo was, and he said it's a type of bird. So I was like, "Okay." And now he explained the expression to me. And because someone did that specifically, because I was talking to this person, then I remember this because there's like emotions related to it. So I didn't really need to like look it up at all after that. But
yeah,
yeah, obviously I've gone off a bit on the tangent there, but
that was a good tangent. It's you're right. Your way of learning is a lot different from mine because even if I'm reading something and I come across a word that I don't know, but I still understand the entire story, I'll still just look up every word that I come across, um, just because I just have to know it. And even if I
right.
understand, even if I understand the story, I still just look it up. So maybe that's a bad habit of mine.
Okay. Well, actually, there's a really interesting talk by this guy, this polyglot. I don't know if you know him. He's called Alexander Arguelles.
I think I've heard of him.
Okay, so his talk was about extensive and intensive reading. I think it was from a polyglot conference or something. It was just a very long chat, and he was talking about the different ways that people can read, and the different ways that are perhaps based on like the more efficient or less efficient. So there are two ways that are very efficient of reading. One of them is intensive and one of them is extensive, but they serve for different things. So you have first the intensive reading, which would be more like your approach, which would be like you're reading a text and you don't understand a word, or you know that it's a word that you haven't come across before, and so you'd always look it up. So that's an intensive way of reading because you look up everything. And what he says is that this type of reading is useful for maybe not for long novels or long books. It's more useful if you're reading a news article, for example. Because if you're reading a news article, you can be more deliberate. You're only going to do it with 10, 20 minutes, maybe even shorter. And so you can focus a lot more during a short period of time. And in that sort of reading, it's useful to look up almost or every word, maybe not every word, but as many like as you want. Uh, and so that's like intensive reading. And he says that this has the most benefit when your comprehension, for example, you read the text and you understand 95% of the words that are there.
Right.
But for him, he includes words. If you understand the word, but you've never come across it before, you understand it for context, that's included within the 95%. But you would think about 95%, perhaps that's quite high, but actually 1 in 20 words that you have no clue about is quite a low comprehension for a text. So you need to look up the words to understand what's going on. Otherwise, you're going to be a bit lost after you've read a few paragraphs. You might have the impression that you understand, but there's a lot of things you've missed and you can't really remember what's going on, or you haven't got like the idea of what was happening. So you need to look up these words, like almost all these words in this situation, because otherwise you're going to get lost and you're not going to be able to follow. But then there's this other type of reading, which is extensive reading. And extensive reading is very useful when you understand 98% of what you are reading. So 1 in every 50 words you have absolutely no clue about. Again, like within this 98% are included the words that you understand from context, or for example, the words that you would understand because you know the word, you know another word from the same word family. For example, you have like a word that includes another word within it, and it just has a couple of grammatical bits on it that make it like an adjective or whatever. But you know, like the verb, and it's an adjective. You might understand that, but without even having seen it before. So that's all included with the 98%. And what it means is, if you have this level of comprehension, you can read the books, and you don't have to look anything up. Um, so
Okay.
that's like almost the other extreme. You don't look up anything. You, but by the end of it, you will pick up a lot of the words. Maybe not absolutely every single word, but you'll pick up almost all the words into your passive vocabulary and later on into your active vocabulary without even trying, without looking them up and learning it, because you will know that you'll be able to work out what they mean generally from the context, because it's only 1 in every 50 that is unknown to you. And the reason why this is beneficial, you're going to say, oh, but it must be slower, right? Because there will be words that you have to come across a few times before you understand them and that. But what you can do is you actually can read a lot more words in general, and you can read quicker. With this level of comprehension, because you don't have to keep stopping to look up. So overall, you're going to get a lot more benefit, because I would say even if you understand absolutely every word in the book, you can still improve by reading it, because you will naturally pick up the grammar structures or become more familiar with the grammar structures and the words that you already know just by reading them again. And of course, then you have this additional benefit of the fact that you have a one word every 50 that is going to be a word that you're likely to pick up. And this allows you to enjoy much more what you're reading rather than always looking up absolutely everything. Of course, intensive reading has its benefits as well, but I prefer to read like this without looking up. But I'm not quite as extreme as that. So I would generally try and find a book that I have between 95, 98% comprehension. Usually now it's closer to 98, but it depends on the page, of course, throughout the whole book. It's not going to be consistent. So I try and find one that I'm as close to 98% as possible, and then I would look up some words. And when would I look up a word? I would look up a word if I've seen it a couple of times and I still don't understand what it means.
Okay.
So, or I still don't get that idea of what it means because you're not going to understand it perfectly the first time. Um, do
Yeah,
you have anything to say about that?
that your method basically goes. It's a good method, and what I did wrong was, um, basically at 2.5 years into my Spanish, I started reading my first novel, and I was looking up basically every single new word, even though it was it was probably like over 10 new words on a single page. And then I got like halfway through the novel, and I realized I had no idea what the story was, what the story was even about, because I was so focused on
Yeah.
learning new words instead of just understanding the story.
Yeah, yeah. As I said, like it's easy to have the impression that you're understanding what's going on, and then you just realize a few chapters later that you have no clue. Uh,
Right.
that's when, for example, you might understand if you the same guy, Alexander, said that when you understand more than 80% of the words, well, 80% is quite low comprehension because it's 1 in 5 words you don't
Right.
understand. Um, you can still have the you can still think that you're understanding the general gist of what's going on, but it's a kind of an illusion because once you've read a few chapters, you're understanding. You think you're understanding, but you're not really getting as much as you need to be able to form an overall idea of what's going on. Um, and I'm sure like your comprehension was higher than 80% when you're reading this novel, but still, you probably needed to look up. Like I know when I first started reading proper novel, I can go on to speak about that now if you like.
Yeah.
Uh, what I did for my first novel that I read after reading these things that were made for learners, like I said, the first novel I tried to read was Harry Potter, the
That's a
first
popular
one in
choice.
Spanish. And it was, I'm not sure why I chose it, but I didn't have this idea of, oh, I already know the story, so that's going to be easier. Maybe I did, or maybe I didn't, but that's not the important thing. I thought, oh, I didn't really know what book to choose. Maybe I read the first Harry Potter because it's popular in the whole world, but in England, it's like massive craze. So it was a book that I knew I liked and that I could be interested in even reading it again. So I thought, oh wow, I'll read it in Spanish. When I started off, I bought this book. I bought the physical copy because I thought it'd be cool to have actually reading the words on a page rather than the screen, like actually have something physical.
Right.
Um, I bought it and I look at the first page and there's so many words that I didn't know. I was like, this scares me. So what I decided to do is I decided to sit down and I had a copy of the English version and the Spanish version at first, and I tried to like compare, but then that was a bit difficult even. So what I did was then just try and translate the words I didn't know in the Spanish version. So I got to that and I did that for the first couple of pages, and it took me like a whole day.
Just comparing.
So I was like, I'm never going to finish the book doing this. Why, why don't I just try and read it anyway and see how well that goes? Like without looking up as much. I don't remember if I found like a video about someone saying that it was good to just read even if you don't understand a lot of it. But I decided that I just wanted to read it anyway and see. And what I found was like after a few chapters, uh, like it was still difficult, but knowing the story definitely helped. And I wasn't really worried about being able to follow the plot because I already knew it. And I definitely picked up a lot of words on the way. And then I actually finished the book. I don't know, remember how long it took me, but it took a fairly long time, at least a month. And it's a very short book, is the first one. Um, but after this month, after I'd finished it, I went back to the first page, like I did look things up along the way, but I wasn't looking up everything. I didn't really have a method of what I looked up and what I didn't. Then I go back to the first page, and suddenly I know like a lot of the words there that I didn't know before.
Right.
Like, and one of the things that's interesting, and I find even now, because there's still obviously when I'm reading a novel, I don't understand all the words. I can pretty much pick up any book if it's a modern one and read it without any problem, without having to look up many things. But there's always going to be new words. What I find is that after a bit, you get used to the style of the author, and you get used to, like even with an audiobook, you get used to the voice and the style. And after you get used to it, then there are certain words that they use in the same way all the time that keep coming up. So once you get used to the style, you can understand it a lot better. Like one of the things that I found the hardest at the start was when, like they try and vary what they say. They don't want to say, and someone says something, said this person's name. They want to use a
Right.
different verb. So they use like tons of different verbs that I didn't know when I started. But what I realize is that the same author, or in this case, the same translator, because it's one person that has translated the whole book and tried to be true to the style, but it's their style. It's a consistent style throughout the whole book. They always use almost the same words throughout the whole time. So once you're used to those words, you don't even have to look them up. You're going to pick them up. There's like no question about it because it's just going to keep coming. And you know that someone's saying something in a certain way because they're being sarcastic or there's an exclamation mark, and you know that because of the context. And then you're going to pick up the verb that they use there and you're going to know roughly what that means. And after you've seen it 100 times, then you're probably going to understand pretty well what it means, if not like as well as you would a word in your own language. Uh, so when you start a book, definitely don't be too scared about like how many things you know because all you got to do is try and push through it because it's always going to be a big step. But once you've done it, like once you've got used to the style and you've got into the story of it, of course, if you know the story, it helps. But even with a book where you don't know the story, the first chapter is going to be the most difficult because you have no context. They're trying to set it up in that point. And I would even suggest to read the first couple of chapters multiple times just to make sure that you understand how it starts and the background. And then when you've done that throughout the whole book, you're going to be so much more relaxed and you're going to be able to understand it a lot better because you've got used to the style, you've got the context there from the first few chapters that helps you understand. So or maybe I haven't done this, but I would say that maybe a good method would be to read the first chapter in an intensive way, looking up a lot of the words, and then read the rest of it like without looking many things up, and that would allow you to combine the both methods in a really good way. Uh,
Right.
that's definitely something that would be good to try, I think.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good method, and it certainly helps when the book is really long. Um, Looking up every single word just isn't feasible. So it's a better method to know that you won't understand everything, but still just understand the story and not necessarily every single word.
Yeah, like, and when I try and read, I want to be able to enjoy it. So I don't want to force myself to. Like there are some days where I have more energy and I would actually look up more words and I would write them down. But there are some days where I often read right before I go to bed and I would try like at the moment I've kind of lost the habit a bit because I'm doing so many other things. But there was a period of time, definitely throughout the pandemic, where I was confined and I definitely read almost every evening right before I went to bed some Spanish. And in that time of day, I'm not really, I'm just want to read. I didn't want to look up words, and I didn't think it's going to be that useful.
Right.
Um, so because like I just want to enjoy it and to read, and it's just a benefit that it's in Spanish, and that would help me with my level as well. So in those period of time, I wouldn't look up as many things, but maybe if in one morning I feel extra motivated and I want to read something, I might look up more things because I know in that point I can just make the effort and try and understand words a bit more and put more attention into it.
Okay. Well, you've gotten really good at reading and listening. So, what are your what are your future plans for this language? And like when you're, I guess in the future, what do you see yourself, at what level do you see you in the future? See yourself?
Mm, well, at the moment, as I said, I'm not really deliberately practicing at all Spanish. What I do is I just read and listen as much as I can, and I'm having the chance to speak with people. So for me, I enjoy a lot what I'm doing with the language, and I know that I'm improving. Of course, it's difficult to see the improvement when you're already at a good level because it's so slow, but I know that I'm still improving. And I think that perhaps in the future I will try and pass the C2 level. I'd already thought about doing C1, but then I decided that I didn't really need a language diploma in that at that time. So I thought, why waste the money? Why not wait and see if I can get to C2 eventually and do that one? Um, so and at the moment, that's not something I'm looking at doing directly, but I think that it's definitely something I will do in the future. But there's no rush for me. The thing is, I just want to enjoy the language, keep gradually improving and just consuming content and speaking with people because for me, like, I've mostly had contact with Spaniards, but there's also like people from Latin America and are included in this. They're some of the nicest people I've ever met. So I really enjoy spending time with them. And as a benefit of that, I just speak with them. I speak with them in Spanish and I improve. I learn a lot. So I have a lot of fun with the language, and it's basically everything I would have wanted when I started, probably. Um,
Just to live in the language?
yeah, just to be able to use it. I've had so many cool experiences already with the language, and now I'm making friends with native speakers and being able to use it almost every day. And I just find that a lot more like very fun.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's so
very
cool.
good feeling.
Yeah, so cool. That's probably a good place to end it. Uh, I think we might be going on 2 hours here. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you go. And yeah, thank you for sharing your success story on this channel.
Thank you.
Yeah, your Spanish is really good. And thanks for coming on the show. Or this on the show, my channel. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, then you'll probably like another interview I did of Cole, who's been perfecting his Spanish for over 10 years. And by the way, if you've gotten to a C1 or C2 level in Spanish, then don't hesitate to send me an email, because I'd love to share more success stories on this channel. See you guys in the next time.